The truck stopped beside the pond before the sun had risen above the low trees to the east. Inside the plastic tanks were tens of thousands of shrimp fingerlings, so small they were almost transparent. Some swam sideways, some lay motionless on the bottom, others twitched weakly whenever the water shifted. To the large shrimp farm a few miles away, they were worthless. They had grown too slowly, developed unevenly, and failed to meet the standards for the next production cycle. Keeping them would mean wasting feed, tank space, and labor on a batch that was unlikely to make a profit. The farm manager looked into the tank, then turned toward the woman standing beside the old salt pond. "You really want them?" Her name was Clara. Behind her stood a struggling farm, burdened by debt, and a brackish pond no one had known how to use for years. During the dry season, the water became so salty that the grass along the bank turned yellow. When the rains came, the pond diluted rapidly, filling with mud and dead leaves washed down from the fields. The neighbors called it a useless hole. For a long time, Clara had believed them. But that morning, as she watched the rejected shrimp, she did not see a failed batch. She saw living creatures still fighting to survive after an entire system had decided they were not worth saving. Perhaps she understood that feeling better than anyone. Clara could not afford healthy commercial stock. She had no money for industrial aerators or an advanced salinity control system. All she had was the old pond, a few second-hand pipes, and the patience of someone with very little left to lose. The manager warned her one final time. Most of them could be dead within a week. Clara looked across the still surface of the pond. But they are not dead yet. She signed the release form, connected the pipes from the truck to the pond, and slowly began transferring the fingerlings into water that no one believed could support a profitable crop. When the truck finally drove away, Clara stood alone on the bank. Beneath the muddy surface, the weakest shrimp from the hatchery disappeared into the darkness. She had no idea how many would survive. She only knew that, from that moment forward, their future and hers were tied to the same forgotten pond. The pond had defeated everyone who tried to use it. It lay at the lowest edge of Clara's property, where rainwater from the fields mixed with salt carried inland from the coast. During dry months, the water became harsh enough to burn the grass along the bank. After heavy rain, the salinity could fall almost overnight. Nothing stayed stable for long. Years earlier, Clara's father had tried raising fish there. The first batch disappeared after a summer heat wave. The second died when a storm washed mud and rotting vegetation into the water. After that, the pond was abandoned. The neighbors called it a useless hole. Commercial farmers used a different word: unmanageable. The banks were soft, the bottom was thick with dark mud, and the deepest section could not be reached without sinking past the ankle. There was no lined basin, no proper drainage system, and no reliable way to replace the water if something went wrong. Yet this was where Clara had released thousands of rejected shrimp. The hatchery manager had warned her before unloading them. "Shrimp need consistency," he said. "That pond changes every time the weather does." Clara knew he was right. She owned a small salinity meter, 2 aging pumps, and a second-hand generator that sometimes failed before it even started. She had no backup pond, no filtration equipment, and no money to purchase another batch if these shrimp died. There was no second attempt waiting behind the first. For 2 days, Clara walked the shoreline from before sunrise until after dark. She tested the water repeatedly and wrote every number in a notebook: temperature, salinity, rainfall, wind direction. The readings changed from one side of the pond to the other. By noon, the shallow edges became dangerously warm. After a brief shower, muddy runoff entered from the eastern field. At night, the still water carried a faint, sour smell from the bottom. Clara scattered a small amount of feed and waited. Nothing rose. No ripples crossed the surface. No shrimp appeared near the bank. There was no way to know whether they were hiding beneath the mud or already dead. By the second evening, the pond looked exactly as it had before the truck arrived: silent, dark, and empty. Clara stood at the edge holding her notebook, wondering whether she had mistaken desperation for opportunity. If the shrimp were gone, she had lost more than a failed experiment. she had lost the last affordable chance to save the farm. By the end of the first week, Clara had stopped asking whether any shrimp had survived. Now she wanted to know why. Every morning before sunrise, she walked to the western bank with a flashlight, a net, and the small notebook she kept inside a plastic bag. The rest of the pond remained quiet, but beneath the floating grass, faint movements disturbed the surface. The shrimp had chosen that corner for a reason. Clara measured the water in several places. Near the center of the pond, the temperature rose quickly after sunrise. Along the eastern bank, runoff from the field caused the salinity to change sharply after rain. But near the western edge, the conditions were different. An old drainage pipe allowed a slow trickle of water to enter beneath the grass. The overhanging plants shaded the surface during the hottest part of the day. Fallen leaves had created a layer of organic material where tiny insects, algae, and other organisms gathered. The area was cooler, calmer, and richer in natural food. Clara began placing small feeding trays around the pond. Most came back untouched. The trays near the western bank, however, were cleaned within hours. The weakest shrimp were not simply surviving. They were learning where survival was possible. Encouraged, Clara used old fencing and wooden stakes to protect the shaded area from larger fish and birds. She cleared only enough vegetation to keep water moving, careful not to destroy the cover the shrimp had chosen. A few days later, she caught one of them in her net. It was still smaller than commercial stock, but its shell was clearer, its movements faster, and its body stronger than when it had arrived. Clara held it above the water for only a moment before releasing it. That single shrimp changed the way she saw the entire pond. The hatchery had judged the animals by how quickly they grew under controlled conditions, but this pond was testing something else: adaptability. Perhaps the rejected shrimp were not weak in every environment. Perhaps they had simply failed in a system built for uniform growth. Clara wrote one sentence across the top of a fresh page in her notebook. "Do not force the pond to behave like a tank." For the first time, she stopped thinking about how to control every part of the water. Instead, she began asking how she could expand the small conditions the shrimp had already chosen for themselves. Clara stopped looking at the pond as a single body of water. Instead, she began to see it as a patchwork of small environments. The western bank stayed cooler beneath the overhanging plants. The center warmed quickly under the sun. The eastern side received runoff after every storm. Near the old drainage pipe, fresh water entered slowly enough to soften sudden changes in salinity. Each part of the pond behaved differently. For the next 2 weeks, Clara marked the shoreline with wooden stakes. At each point, she recorded water temperature, salinity, depth, clarity, and the amount of food left on her feeding trays. Patterns began to appear. The shrimp fed most actively in the early morning and shortly after sunset. During the hottest hours, they moved deeper or gathered beneath floating vegetation. After rain, they avoided the eastern bank, where the water changed too quickly. Clara realized that the pond was not failing randomly. It was constantly giving warnings. Cloudy water near the field meant fresh runoff had entered. A sour smell from the mud meant too much organic material was collecting without enough water movement. Small bubbles rising from the bottom told her that the deeper mud was beginning to lose oxygen. She could not afford expensive monitoring equipment, so she relied on simple tools and close observation. She opened the old drainage channel to improve circulation. She placed bundles of branches along exposed banks to create shade and shelter. She moved feeding trays away from unstable areas instead of wasting food where the shrimp would not stay. Most importantly, she stopped clearing every plant from the pond. The vegetation slowed the wind, protected the banks, cooled the surface, and created hiding places for the young shrimp. What others had called weeds were part of the system keeping them alive. One evening, Clara stood near the western bank as dozens of tiny ripples spread beneath the grass. The shrimp were feeding. Not because she had forced the pond into perfect conditions, but because she had learned where its natural stability already existed. She wrote another line in her notebook. "The pond does not need to be controlled everywhere. It needs to be understood in the right places." That idea became the foundation of everything she built afterward. The heat arrived without warning. For 3 days the wind disappeared and the sun pressed down on the pond from morning until evening. The shallow water warmed quickly, while the muddy bottom continued consuming oxygen as leaves and other organic matter decomposed. Clara noticed the first warning at sunset. The shrimp were no longer hiding beneath the vegetation. They had gathered near the surface, moving slowly along the bank as if searching for air. A few climbed onto the feeding trays and remained there instead of retreating into the water. Clara checked the temperature. It was higher than anything she had recorded. She started both old pumps, hoping to move cooler water through the pond. One coughed, rattled, and stopped after 20 minutes. The other continued running, but its weak stream barely disturbed the surface. Then the generator failed. By midnight, Clara was standing knee-deep in the pond, dragging a wooden board through the water to create movement. She filled buckets and poured them back from shoulder height, trying to break the surface and pull oxygen into the water. It was not enough. At dawn, pale shapes appeared along the eastern bank. Dozens of shrimp lay motionless in the mud. More floated beneath the plants. By the time the sun rose, Clara had stopped counting. For hours, she collected the dead shrimp in silence. The loss was larger than anything she could afford. Every handful represented food, fuel, and time she had already invested. More painfully, it felt like proof that everyone had been right about the pond. That afternoon, the hatchery manager drove past and stopped near the gate. "I warned you," he said. Clara did not answer. After he left, she sat beside the broken generator with her notebook open on her knees. She reviewed every measurement from the previous week. The disaster had not happened without warning. The water temperature had risen each afternoon. The feeding trays had been emptying more slowly. The sour smell from the mud had grown stronger. Small bubbles had appeared in deeper areas. She had seen the signs, but she had not yet understood how quickly they could become deadly. Clara sold an old livestock trailer and used the money to buy a reliable pump, repair the generator, and install simple aeration lines across the shallowest sections. She removed excess decaying material and reduced feeding while the water recovered. The pond had punished her first major mistake, but it had also taught her the lesson that would protect every crop that followed. Survival was not only about finding good conditions. It was about recognizing when those conditions were beginning to disappear. 3 weeks after the heat wave, Clara pulled one of the feeding trays from the western bank and froze. Several shrimp clung to the mesh. They were no longer pale, fragile fingerlings. Their shells had darkened, their bodies had thickened, and their tails snapped with enough force to spray water across her boots. Clara placed a few in a shallow measuring tub. They were still uneven in size, but some had grown faster than she expected. More surprising was their condition. The survivors looked stronger than the commercial shrimp she had seen at the hatchery. The pond had removed the weakest individuals, but it had also revealed something the hatchery had overlooked. The shrimp that survived were highly adaptable. Clara began sampling them every week. She recorded their weight, shell condition, feeding behavior, and the parts of the pond where they were caught. The best growth did not occur in the cleanest-looking water. It occurred near areas rich in algae, tiny crustaceans, and decomposing plant matter. The pond was producing food of its own. That discovery allowed Clara to reduce the amount of purchased feed. Instead of feeding heavily across the entire pond, she used smaller portions near the areas where the shrimp naturally gathered. The water stayed cleaner. Costs fell. Growth improved. Months later, Clara harvested a small test batch and cooked them in a cast-iron pan with nothing but salt and butter. The meat was firm and slightly sweet. It did not taste like the frozen shrimp sold at the local supermarket. The flavor was fuller, with a clean mineral note that reminded her of the coast. She carried a cooler to a small roadside restaurant and asked the owner to try them. He examined the shrimp carefully. "They are not all the same size," he said. "I know. They will not look uniform on a plate. I know that too." The owner cooked 3 of them, tasted one, then immediately reached for another. "Bring me 20 pounds next week." Clara stared at him. She had expected interest. She had not expected an order. The quality once rejected by the hatchery, their unevenness, was becoming part of their value. These were not factory-perfect shrimp. They were pond-raised, naturally adapted, and harvested fresh. For the first time, Clara understood that she did not need to compete with industrial farms on volume. She only needed to offer something they could not. The restaurant owner kept his promise. The following week, Clara delivered 20 pounds of shrimp packed in ice inside 2 old coolers. She expected the order to last several days. It was gone by the end of the first dinner service. Customers asked where the shrimp came from. A few said they had never tasted anything like them. The owner placed a handwritten note beside the evening special: local salt pond shrimp, harvested this morning. By the weekend, he called Clara again. Can you bring 40 pounds next time? Clara looked across the pond and hesitated. She had enough shrimp, but she had never harvested at that scale. She also feared removing too many too quickly and damaging the population she had worked so hard to protect. So she began harvesting selectively. She kept the smaller shrimp in the pond and sold only those that had reached the right size. She recorded how many pounds came from each section, how much feed had been used, and how quickly the remaining shrimp continued growing. The restaurant owner introduced her to 2 other chefs. One ran a seafood cafe near the highway. The other worked at a small hotel known for using local ingredients. Both wanted the same thing: shrimp that could be delivered fresh, not frozen for weeks, and shipped hundreds of miles. Clara's problem was no longer finding a buyer. It was producing enough without destroying what made the shrimp special. She refused to crowd the pond. Instead, she created a waiting list and arranged deliveries on specific harvest days. The limited supply made the shrimp more desirable. Soon, customers began asking for them by name. Not the local shrimp, not the pond shrimp. They asked for Clara's shrimp. She printed simple labels with the harvest date and the words, "Raised in a naturally managed brackish pond." The phrase became part of her identity. Each delivery brought in more money than the last, but Clara used almost all of it to strengthen the operation. She bought better coolers, repaired the access road, added backup aeration, and installed a small covered area where the shrimp could be sorted and packed safely. The first buyer had done more than place an order. He had proven that Clara's shrimp belonged in a different market. Industrial farms sold uniformity and volume. Clara was selling freshness, flavor, scarcity, and a story people wanted to repeat. Demand continued to grow, but Clara refused to expand carelessly. She knew the pond had succeeded because she had learned its limits. If she crowded it with too many shrimp, increased feeding too quickly, or ignored changes in the water, she could lose everything again. So instead of turning the entire farm into one large production pond, she divided the operation into smaller zones. The western section remained a nursery and recovery area, where young shrimp could shelter beneath vegetation. The deeper center became the main growing area. A shallow section near the drainage channel was used to monitor new batches before they were released into the rest of the pond. Each zone had its own feeding schedule, water checks, and harvest plan. Clara also stopped depending on a single crop. She raised small groups at different stages so that not all the shrimp would be ready at once. This allowed her to supply restaurants more regularly without emptying the pond during a single harvest. The system was slower than industrial farming, but it was safer. She hired a neighbor to help on harvest mornings and paid a local teenager to clean equipment and prepare delivery boxes. What had begun as a desperate experiment was now creating work for other people. Clara kept the business simple. Restaurants placed orders several days in advance. Shrimp were harvested before sunrise, sorted by size, packed in ice, and delivered the same morning. She charged more than wholesale distributors, but the chefs received a fresher product with a reliable story behind it. She also created different products from the uneven sizes. The largest shrimp went to high-end restaurants. Medium shrimp were sold to cafes and seafood markets. Smaller ones were packaged for stews, pasta dishes, and local family orders. Nothing had to be treated as waste. By the end of the second season, Clara had regular buyers in 3 nearby towns. Her weekly harvests were no longer measured in a few coolers. She needed insulated containers, printed invoices, scheduled delivery routes, and records for every batch. She was still working from the same forgotten salt pond, but now the pond was part nursery, part growing system, part testing ground, and part brand. The business did not grow because Clara forced the pond to produce more. It grew because she built every decision around what the pond could sustain. That difference allowed her to expand without destroying the system that had made her shrimp valuable in the first place. The hatchery manager returned at the beginning of Clara's third season. This time, he did not arrive to warn her. He came with 2 employees, a clipboard, and a truck carrying new tanks. For several minutes he stood beside the western bank, watching workers sort shrimp beneath the covered packing area. The operation looked nothing like the desperate experiment he remembered. Orders were written on a board by delivery route. Harvest dates were marked beside restaurant names. Each container carried a batch number, harvest time, and destination. Clara approached him without stopping her work. "What brings you here?" The manager glanced toward the pond. "We have been hearing about your shrimp." Clara said nothing. The hatchery had recently lost several restaurant clients to smaller local suppliers. Its shrimp were consistent in size, but chefs complained about long delivery chains, frozen storage, and declining flavor. Now the manager wanted to buy Clara's surviving stock for breeding trials. He also offered her regular access to rejected batches, the same type of shrimp he had once considered unworthy of feed and tank space. "We could create a partnership," he said. "We provide the stock. You grow it. We share the market." Years earlier, Clara would have accepted immediately. Now she understood the value of what she had built. The business was not successful simply because the hatchery had given her cheap shrimp. It succeeded because she had learned the pond, absorbed the losses, developed the market, and earned the trust of every buyer. She was not interested in becoming a low-cost grower for the company that had dismissed her. But she did see an opportunity. Clara proposed different terms. She would test small batches, but she would control how they were raised, when they were harvested, and where they were sold. The hatchery would pay for the trials and provide health records for every batch. Any successful strain developed from the program would carry her farm's name. The manager looked surprised. "You are asking for a lot." Clara looked toward the packing shed, where another order was being loaded for delivery. "No," she replied. "I am protecting what took me years to build." A week later, the hatchery accepted. The same company that had once dumped its weakest stock into her pond now paid Clara to teach it which shrimp could survive outside a controlled tank. The balance of power had changed. She was no longer receiving what others threw away. She was deciding what their discarded stock was worth. By the end of Clara's third full season, the numbers in her notebook no longer looked like those of a struggling pond. Restaurant contracts, direct family orders, hatchery trials, and premium harvests had pushed the farm's annual revenue past 6 figures. The achievement did not arrive with a celebration. It arrived on an ordinary morning while Clara sat at the packing table, adding the final invoices for the season. She checked the total twice, certain she had made a mistake. Then she checked it again. The number remained the same. Years earlier, she had stood beside the pond with no capital, no reliable equipment, and thousands of shrimp that another farm had thrown away. Now the same pond supported several local jobs, supplied restaurants across 3 towns, and generated enough income to clear the farm's oldest debts. But Clara knew revenue was not the same as easy money. A large portion went back into pumps, fuel, feed, testing, labor, cold storage, and repairs. The business had survived because she expanded carefully, not because the pond had suddenly become limitless. She continued rejecting orders that would force her to overcrowd the water. She refused to promise harvests the pond could not support. Every new contract had to fit the same rules she had learned during the first season. Protect the water. Watch the animals. Do not confuse faster growth with stronger growth. Clara also created a small nursery for adaptive stock from each successful harvest. Instead of choosing shrimp only by size, she selected them for survival, feeding behavior, and their ability to handle gradual changes in the pond. The animals once labeled weak had become the foundation of a more resilient line. One evening, after the final delivery truck had left, Clara walked to the western bank. The floating grass still moved with tiny ripples beneath it. The old drainage pipe still released a slow stream into the pond. The place looked almost the same as it had on the morning the rejected shrimp arrived. But Clara had changed. She no longer saw failure as proof that something had no value. Sometimes failure only meant that a living thing had been judged by the wrong conditions. The hatchery had seen shrimp that could not perform inside its system. Clara had built a new system around what those shrimp could do. That was how an unwanted batch became a six-figure business. Not through luck, not through a miracle, but through observation, patience, and the decision to look twice at what everyone else had already discarded.